Okay, ready when you are.
Right. Thank you all for being here. I think I know everyone here, but just in case, I'm Zoë Misiewicz. I'm in the math department, and I'm going to be talking about a comparison of my pre-calculus courses in spring 2025 versus spring 2026. So spring 2025 is what I'm calling the worst of times. Spring 2026 may not have been entirely the best of times, but certainly the best I've seen since the pandemic. So I'll be talking about some of the things that changed, both deliberately and sometimes by chance, and then how we can use those lessons to increase success for all of our students. So I'll begin with a bit of background, then I'll show you the results so you can see just how dramatic this difference was, and then I'll talk about what changed that got us from the one situation to the next one. So a bit of background. We've been offering corequisite support sections of college algebra and pre-calculus in the fall since 2021. And so the idea of these was that we can take students who are slightly below the preparation level they would normally need for these courses. And if we meet for an extra 80 minutes a week, then we can use that time to fill in any gaps in their background knowledge and sort of accelerate them through their math courses. And so initially those courses were open only to students with slightly lower placement scores. But after the first year, we did open them to all students. So not only the less prepared ones, but also students who placed into the regular course. And on average, the students in extra support sections do slightly better than the students in the regular sections, even though they're a bit less prepared on average. But the results are still not great. It's like maybe they did 10 percentage points better on the final exam, but it's like 56 versus 46. So doing better, but still not very impressive results overall. But in spring 2026, I taught two sections of extra support pre-calculus to students who were officially prepared for regular pre-calculus. So not trying to accelerate underprepared students, but just providing extra support for our regular students. And that's when I saw results that were dramatically better. So, I'll go right into the results so you can see immediately just how dramatic it was. I'm starting with the grades on the common final exam because obviously there are multiple ways to increase student grades. One of them is just to increase the grades regardless of the learning. But the final exam results show that the students actually were learning a lot more. So in spring 2025, more than a quarter of the students didn't even make it to the final exam. They withdrew or they just didn't show up. And then maybe a quarter of them failed the exam by a little, just over a quarter actually passed the exam. Versus in spring 2026, suddenly more than 70% of students were passing that final exam. So if you can imagine what this felt like in the classroom, it was very, very different to have the students actually understanding the material versus struggling and disappearing. And those results in the common final also carried over to the course grades as you would expect. So overall course grades in spring 2025 were not good, we'll say, right? 20% withdrawal, 25% E, which is really interesting in light of the late withdrawal policy, I'll say, since Paul is here. A lot of those students who got E's really should have been withdrawing. But by spring 2026, that issue wasn't even relevant because there weren't students really withdrawing or failing the course. There was, one student who withdrew, one student who failed, but the majority of the students were passing, and not just scraping by, but a strong majority were passing with what we'd consider a successful grade, C- or above. So this graph, I'm showing the percent of students because the two courses or the two sets of courses did have significantly different enrollment numbers. So spring 2025, the two courses were pretty much fully enrolled, 55 students across the two sections. In spring 2026, there were only 26 students across the two sections because I think the combination of 9 a.m. plus the extra hour is a hard sell to begin with. The extra hour at 9 a.m. was very lowly enrolled. So if you want to see the raw numbers, Here you can see the actual number of students achieving the different grades. So even with half the students in spring 26, the raw numbers of students being successful was higher. Then one thing that someone at least suggested when I presented this data was, well, it's a common final, it's graded by different people. So I graded half of it, the other instructor graded half of it, and it wasn't the same other instructor in spring 25 versus spring 26. So maybe that person was just such an extremely more generous grader that accounts for the difference. But you can see that this same pattern was happening even at the midterm grades. So it wasn't just about the final exam being different. And we did give the exact same common final exam both years so that we could compare directly. So maybe at this time I'll pause and see if there are any questions so far about just what the results are showing before I get into how this happened. Does anyone have any questions? All right, then I'll continue on to what changed. So the first thing I already mentioned briefly, so this idea of corequisite support for all. So not just offering extra support to the students who are struggling, but extra support to students who, at least by our standard metrics, are considered prepared for that course. And we gave them the extra support anyway. They were in this class that met an extra 80 minutes a week. If anyone's interested, I can come back later to exactly how students ended up enrolled in this course. But there was self-selection there, so it wasn't entirely random. But what was the extra time used for? So first of all, extended review. So a lot of these students were coming straight out of college algebra in the fall. They had, in theory, learned a lot of this material just 2 months previously. And so that meant in a normal course, the expectation would be that the students know this material or at least need very brief review. But that is not actually the case. You know, a student coming in with a C or even a B, they know maybe the majority of the material, but there's some that they never really knew the first time. There's some extra material that they forgot over winter break. Maybe whatever was in the last week of class, they didn't even have a chance to process at all. So I took the extra time to really go over the review as if it were new material. Not you should be expected to know this, but here is some things that you need to know, so I'm going to teach them to you. So this, I think, is really the crucial thing with the extra time, that you can then spend more time on the challenging topics. So maybe it shouldn't seem like a revelation, but it really is a revelation that when students struggled with something, we could spend more time on it. So for example, we're doing function operations, and I see they're really struggling with fractions. They're always really struggling with fractions. So we just spend an extra day or two on that. We were proving trigonometric identities. They learned it in theory. They had homework on it. We had a test on it. They still didn't really know it. So we spent 2 extra days on that topic with all the students working in groups at the blackboards. So they're really engaged and getting the opportunity to master the material instead of just seeing it once. And so in the normal 3-hour class, there's not time for this at all. You see the material, then we have to move on. So I think the vast majority of our students benefit from this extra time. 2 days for final review. So again, in the 3-hour-a-week class, there's no extra time at all. The students learn new material on the Friday, the last day of classes. They have their final exam at 8 a.m. on Monday. I've always actually been surprised that Oswego doesn't have any day off for review between the end of classes and the start of exams, because it's really not an ideal learning situation. But in the class with the extra time, I could actually take 2 days for review at the end of the semester. So we finished learning new material on Tuesday. We had the Wednesday and the Friday for the review, and then they had the final exam on Monday. So they had almost a week's gap to actually process last material, to review and make sure it was fully in their minds. So another thing I changed, not related to the extra time, but just a change that I thought would be beneficial. I reduced the number of homework topics that they have. This course uses the ALEX homework system. So instead of me assigning specific topics, I assign categories, and the system will give them 3 to 5 questions on a topic if they get it right. If they get it wrong, then they'll do additional topics or additional questions on that topic. And when you create a set of topics, Alex will then recommend additional ones that it says are review or background that would be helpful in learning this. And so at first I had just accepted all of the Alex recommendations. You said square roots are helpful here, so let's add the topic on square roots. But as I looked at how the students were actually spending their time and what was in some of these review topics, sometimes the review topics went much more in depth into the topic than we actually needed for the course itself. So when we're doing square roots, we really need to know multiplying square roots. We don't need to know adding square roots. We don't need to know simplifying square roots. So I took out a lot of the topics that were not actually essential for what students were doing in that class. And by paring down the topics, it also meant that if the students were not finishing all of their homework, which you can see in both cases, the students didn't on average finish all of their homework. At least the homework that they were doing was more focused on what was essential from my perspective. So I cut down the number of topics by about 20%, but you can see that most of that came out of the algebra and geometry review or the equations and inequalities topic. The students actually ended up learning more about graphs and functions, about exponential and logarithmic equations, and about trigonometric identities and equations. So it made the homework seem a bit more manageable to them to have those fewer topics. And I put a quote from Brian Dewsbury there at the bottom. You may recall he was the speaker at our academic affairs retreat a few years ago, and he is a biology instructor, and he talked about how they had reduced the number of topics in their 100 level biology course, and the students actually did better in subsequent courses. So reducing content doesn't necessarily mean you're actually reducing learning, you're focusing the learning on the things that are really important. So that was another change not related to the extra time. I also focused more on building relationships with the students and also the students with each other. So in 2024-25, there was a focus group that they conducted as part of the Title III grant. They spoke to students in math classes, and they found that the students, I said in lower level math classes, I don't remember whether it included upper level math courses as well, the students didn't know or interact with each other. So Dean Croyle presented a 1-hour training on group work to our whole department in August 2025, and it was a really effective session. I included unattributed, but a quote or a comment from a colleague that I heard, which was that 1-hour training about those relationships was more valuable than all of AQ. So I found that the dean was extremely helpful in showing us how to get students to interact with each other in very basic ways, like you need to assign the groups yourself instead of just saying find a partner, because saying find a partner, now you're putting an extra social burden on the students. They're not comfortable with that. But if you just say you two work together, then they'll do it. You've taken away that additional awkward step. And also the group size, she said never more than 3. You can have 2, 3 is okay, but once you get into 4, there will be people just sitting around, not actually doing the work, relying on other people. So literally just those 2 changes of assigning groups and controlling the group size more tightly than I had initially done really made a big difference. And so as part of that relationship building, it's also very important to have appropriate classroom arrangements, not only in pre-calculus, but in the class before it. So when the students are sitting in fixed rows, it's much harder to get them to interact with each other, to move around. They may talk to the student sitting right next to them, but then if that student is away, they're not going to talk to someone else. And sometimes I couldn't even get close to the students if the rows were too tightly organized, or if they go right up to the wall. I sometimes just couldn't even see what the student in the wall or right at the wall was doing. And so this actually wasn't a difference in my pre-calculus courses, but in my college algebra in the previous fall. So fall 2024, both of those classes were fixed rows where interaction was a struggle. and that impacted the students who were coming into pre-calculus in the spring. And so I want to thank Joey, who's here, who agreed to switch one of his classrooms with me this spring to allow me to have the flexible, movable desks where the students will move around more. And also Kamal, who I don't think is here. He was extremely helpful. He agreed to switch classes with me, even though it meant that he had 2 back-to-back classes in 2 different rooms. And it really made an enormous difference to me. So thank you to both Kamal and Joey for that. Another thing that I think really made a difference was the change in the academic standing policy. I'm glad that Paul is here because I think that might be more of interest to him. So first semester students now need to complete only 9 credits to remain in good standing. And so if you look at the students who were in my pre-calculus courses in both of these semesters in spring 2025, more than a third of the students in that class were on academic probation. And being on academic probation is in itself a huge source of stress to the students beyond any factors in their academics that led them to be on academic probation. Now they know they're one misstep away from getting kicked out entirely. And I try to tell them, you can appeal a disqualification, you can come back after, it's not the end of the world, but that's not really how they see it. So if a student is on academic probation and then halfway through the semester they realize their chemistry course is going terribly, it has nothing to do with my class at all, but they know I can't withdraw or fail from a single course or I'm kicked out of college, so if one course goes off the rails, I might as well give up on everything. That's the sort of attitude that the students often have. And so again, lowering that number from 36% to 15% made a dramatic difference. It's not only the policy that led to this change in the students on academic probation. There were also other factors that I'll get to later, but I do think that was a very helpful change for our first year students. Another thing that made an enormous difference is instructor workload. So as they say, faculty teaching conditions are student learning conditions. Both spring 2025 and spring 2026, I taught our standard load of 12 contact hours, but it looked completely different. So in spring 2025, I had 3 different preps of all fully enrolled 100-level courses. In spring 2026, I had only 2 different preps and a really exceptionally low number of students. So I'd say a normal course load for our department would be somewhere in the middle of those, maybe 2 preps and 75 students. Having the 110 students and the 3 different preps really meant I was not at my best that semester, and my focus was on the one semi-new prep that I hadn't taught for 5 years. Whereas in spring 2026, I could give more of my attention to the pre-calculus course and to the students in that course. And related to that, I made review packets for tests, and there was also one I gave out for the final exam that another instructor had made. This is something I used to not do. I thought, learning how to prepare for a test is also part of your responsibility as a student. I don't want you to study just the things that I told you to study, but I've come to see it differently in the past maybe 3 to 4 years, that this is a way to motivate students to do the preparation that I want them to do. So I give out a review packet that's longer than the test, not just an exact copy of the test. It has some topics that don't even end up appearing on the test. It's pretty thorough. And this is something I started doing, like I say, in college algebra maybe a few years ago, but then there were at least 2 years when I would have liked to give review packets in pre-calculus, and I just didn't have time to put those together. So again, the instructor workload does make a big difference in student outcomes as well. Another thing that I think made a difference is how many of the students were coming from a successful previous course, college algebra, versus how many were just trying pre-calculus again after failing it in the fall, or getting a low grade in the fall. So in spring 2025, almost a quarter of my students were coming off of an unsuccessful attempt in pre-calculus, just taking the course again. And that usually doesn't end well for them. So 61% of those were unsuccessful and 23% got a D. In spring 2026, only half the proportion of students was repeating the course after an immediate earlier attempt. So I didn't include in this number a student who might have taken the course a few years ago and has now come back and substantially changed as a student. I was only looking at, did they just retake this course that they tried in the fall before? And so again, the majority of those were unsuccessful. The one who did manage to succeed got a C minus, so it wasn't an amazing result, but they did get through it. So this is something that we are trying to address through placement. It's an ongoing discussion, but at least many of us in the math department would like to have a placement test used only for a single attempt at the course. And if you're unsuccessful, we'd ideally like the students to reassess their placement by retaking the placement test and looking at other factors, like look at the instructor's recommendation of the course that they just took, instead of just saying, you know, Alex, that we took for 1 hour in the summer at home, says that I'm ready for this course, so I'll take the course 3 times, regardless of how it's going. But then you might wonder, why were there fewer students repeating the course? So again, self-selection was a major part of it. The students in the spring get to choose their own courses as opposed to in the fall when their advisors make their courses. So the advisors are more likely to put a student into a 4.5-hour course than the students are to choose a 4.5-hour course versus a 3-hour version of the same course, if all else is equal, if they don't know anything about the situation. So the majority of the students that I had in my classes this spring were students who had just taken college algebra with me in the fall. And so they were just continuing with the familiar instructor. And that's a bit of an issue because we ideally would want students to be in the courses where they are most likely to be successful, not relying on individual personal advertising from the instructor. But that at least we're addressing at a departmental level. So all of our pre-calculus courses going forward will be the 4.5-hour version. Another factor that reduced the number of repeats was that there was some unusually generous grading in fall 2025 in one of the pre-calculus sections. So some students who might, or 2 of the pre-calculus sections. So some students who might normally have failed actually did end up passing despite low grades on the common final. And again, we can address that issue more systematically by improving the placement system and having unsuccessful students retake the placement test. It doesn't really help to move on an unprepared student to Calculus 1. That just shifts the problem into another course. There were also some random things that affected the outcomes. So I actually think those 3 snow days we had at the start of the semester, I had a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday class. So Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday were supposed to be snow days, or were supposed to be course days, and they were snow days. I think that was very helpful in giving the students a bit of time to sit and get into the homework system instead of they're trying to juggle figuring out where all these classes are, moving around, and then somehow they're supposed to do homework on top of that in the first week, but it ends up sort of being an afterthought. To help them with that, I also posted detailed daily checklists of what they should do on Brightspace for each day. I continued this for the first few weeks until after a few weeks the students weren't actually using the checklists anymore. But while they were sitting at home, they had nothing to do except be on their computer and try to do whatever tasks I assigned to them. They were actually using those checklists and doing the things they were supposed to be doing. Another random chance is that one of the sections of college algebra in the fall was added late. So we almost always have 4 sections of college algebra in the fall. And in general, as I said, the 4.5-hour sections are less popular and fill up later, even though students in these sections do better. So that's obviously an issue that we'll be talking about with the advisors at some point, trying to really show these results and say, why don't you put even the more prepared students into these courses? The courses where students are doing better, you would hope would fill up faster. But it's not the case. And so last fall, one of the regular 3-hour sections was added later in the enrollment period. So more students ended up in the 4.5-hour sections at the beginning. And so if you imagine sort of the level of student preparation of a student who gets all their paperwork done right away at the beginning and gets enrolled in their courses fast versus a student who's waiting until August to decide what to do for college or maybe to like finish processing their paperwork, that does make a difference in the sort of approach they bring to the course overall. Maybe a small difference, but I think it contributed to stronger students in that fall college algebra who then went into pre-calculus. So those were the things I could think of in terms of changes. My takeaways are that the best results come from proactively providing support to students who don't officially need it. So instead of saying this corequisite support is for students who are not prepared to be in the course, if we see that our DEW's rates in these courses are not what we'd like them to be, then even our theoretically prepared students also need extra help, and we can provide that. For advisors, I don't know if there are a lot of advisors here. I know Paul does at least AP advising. So students who are qualified to enroll in 3-hour college algebra this fall can do even better in the 4.5-hour sections. So if you have the opportunity, if it fits their schedule, try to put the students in those sections, even if they don't officially need it. And the most important takeaway, I think, is that it gives us hope for all of our students that it is possible for students to thrive in these lower level math courses. So in one of my classes, one of the 2 sections, not a single student failed or withdrew. Every single student passed the course, and that's something that we can work towards for all of our students. So thank you for listening. Then any questions?
So Zoe, are you going to track students into Math 210 or 208? I guess some of them will go.
Yeah, I do normally track them from semester to semester. So I'll see how they do this fall.
It would be nice if this does what you expect and benefits students in the next rung of the ladder as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would certainly expect that a student who is getting, 80% on the final exam would do better than a student who maybe scraped by with a 50% on the final exam. So I'd be surprised if it made no difference, but I'll definitely look at the numbers. Other questions or comments? I see there are lots of people here. I don't know if anyone would be more likely to comment if we turned off the recording at this point. I don't know if that's an allowed thing, but...
No, yeah, we can do that. Let me turn it off for a second.